Okay, this is the Integumentary System, part one. Believe 6 parts total. So we've kind of finished that hierarchical organization where we took care of the chemistry, the cells, and the tissues. And so now, basically, the rest of the semester and the rest of 169 is just going over organ and organ systems. As we do, though, we're going to still go back to tissues and to cells, as you will see in this one. Also, customarily, what I do is the beginning of each, not necessarily every single one, but what I'll try and do is just come up with a bullet point list of the functions of the particular system, and then talk about the components, and then obviously relate structure and function. So this is just kind of a laundry list of the functions of the integumentary system. First and foremost is going to be protection, provides us a barrier from chemical, physical, and mechanical trauma. It's also going to be involved with body temperature regulation. This is going to be accomplished by the blood vessels dilating when it's trying to cool us, and constriction when it's trying to warm us, right? The first areas that are going to be affected by frostbite are fingers and toes, right? Because dermal blood vessels are going to constrict, reduce blood flow to that particular area to try and keep the core warm. Another way that it's going to be involved with regulating body temperature, and I believe we've already talked about this when we talked about negative feedback mechanisms, is increasing sweat gland secretions to help cool the body. And we talked about how it's the evaporation of sweat, really, and not the production of sweat that cools us. Integumentary system is also going to be involved with cutaneous sensation. You can see there's really nothing listed here. We're just briefly going to touch on this. We'll get into greater detail with that when we get to the very last chapter in 168, where we talk about special senses. We're also going to see that there are metabolic functions, and if body temperature regulation, if that constriction and dilation is going to work, then that means that skin blood vessels have to have a pretty rich blood supply. And if you've ever had a facial cut in particular, you'll know that it bleeds a ton. And then probably the least important one is excretion. There are some impurities that are excreted through the skin, but it is so minor. I debate whether or not to even put this up here, because this could potentially reinforce this notion of, what are some of these weird things that they're like, these pieces of tape or something that you can put on your feet, and it helps draw out all of the impurities and toxins through your skin, and that's all just BS. It's not true. Very, 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 very little excretion actually happens with the integumentary system. So the integumentary system involves more than the skin. It's skin, hair, and nails. We're really not going to talk about nails, maybe as a mechanism to check certain things, but we're not going to go over the structure of a nail. And we're very, very briefly going to go over the structure of a hair and how it helps us with cutaneous sensation. So really, even though the integumentary system is more than just the skin, our focus really is just going to be the skin. And the skin technically really consists of 2 major regions. You'll see in just a second. We say that it consists of 3, just to try and keep things easy. We have the epidermis, which is that outermost superficial region, the dermis, which is that middle region, and then we have the hypodermis. Hypo means below, so it's below the dermis. It's also known as the superficial fascia. So these 2 terms might seem that they conflict with each other, but superficial fascia, so it's superficial to something. What is it superficial to? It's going to be superficial to the muscle. Okay. It's technically not considered part of the skin. However, it's just easier to cover it here. So we have epithelial tissue in the epidermis, connective tissue in the dermis, and then the hypodermis is primarily adipose tissue, but also some areolar. So you see there's more connective tissue, and then deep to that is going to be muscle. So really how we're going to approach this is we're going to just talk about the epidermis first, then the dermis. So here's the skin. So this is what we're going to focus on first. This is our epithelial tissue. We're going to break that up into layers. The dermis, we'll also break that up into layers. And then here's this hypodermis, primarily made up of adipose tissue. So let's start with the epidermis. The epidermis is stratified squamous, and it's keratinized. So this is a protein, and it is a water-proofing protein. So it is a keratinized stratified squamous epithelium consisting of 4 distinct cell types in 4 or 5 layers, depending on if we're talking about thick or thin skin. And we'll go over that. So for this first part, all I want to do, and it's tough. Normally I would want to kind of talk about the 4 cell types and the layers all in one unit. I'm just trying to make this more manageable. So in this unit, all we're going to do is we're going to identify these cell types. Part 2, then we're going to go over these layers and identify where these cell types exist in these layers. So it is kind of breaking it up. You may really want to consider doing part 1 and part 2 kind of together. All right, so let's identify these cell types. So we have the keratinocytes. These are the cells that are charged with producing that waterproofing protein, keratin. So by far, these keratinocytes are going to be the most abundant. So almost every cell that you take a look at, when you were taking a look at that stratified squamous in lab or for lab, almost everything that you were seeing were these keratinocytes. We're going to have these melanocytes that produce melanin. I'm going to talk more about how they do this and where that melanin accumulates in part 2. So again, these are really just identification. Now we have Langerhans cells. So, or epidermal dendritic cells, they can also be called. What we're going to see is as we go over each system, in many cases, there are these specialized cells that are involved with the immune system. And here's our first case. So we have these Langerhans cells, and these are again associated with the immune system. They are macrophages. In case we haven't covered what that is, these are cells that will just eat foreign material. And then we're going to have Merkel cells. All right, these Merkel cells will function as touch receptors. Again, we're going to just briefly touch on that, pun intended, right now. Go into much greater detail later on at the end of 168 when we talk about special senses. And so the stem cells, because these cells constantly are sloughing off, these stem cells that give rise, really what they're going to do is they're going to give rise to these keratinocytes. All right. So again, next part 2, we're going to take a look at the layers, and it's really going to be helpful if you keep all of these cell types in mind. All right. And that's it.